a letter which was sent to him and which was simply written, Khushwant Singh, Bastard, India.
Quality which you get here, the quality of audience which you get here, cannot be matched in any part of the country.
KSLitFest. Last year I was here to launch my book, celebrating a very special woman in my life.
I just believed that really good sex meant that the marriage would be stable. If the marriage was stable, society would be stable. And if society was stable, the kingdom would be stable.
Jaffi there, I think there's been much talked about. Do you regret having done what you did? My Jaffi was no conspiracy, it was no Raphael deal. Good Lord.
What I can say is it's been stimulating, it's been attentive, it's been large, and it's been very agreeable.
जहाँ हर धर्म के लोग अपने ईश्वर को रब के नाम से पुकारा करते थे। इसी सरहद पे कल डूबा था सूरज, होके दो टुकड़े।
Hi everyone, welcome to the first digital Khushwant Singh Literary Festival. Before we carry on to the main program, I just want to say a little bit of background about the LitFest and about Kasoli and about my father Khushwant Singh. My name is Rahul Singh. About 9 years ago in Kasoli, where there's a family home, we were sitting there together with the brigadier then in charge. As you know, Kasoli is the cantonment and the brigadier is the big boss there. And this was Brigadier Anant Narayanan, a fast-seeing brigadier who's now a general. And while talking with him, we suddenly got the idea of a Khushwant Singh Lit Fest in Kasoli. And there's a lovely location, the Kasoli Club. So we decided we would have it there, and that was about 9 years ago. For 8 years, we've had it continuously. This year too, Naveen Mahajan, the new brigadier there, had said wanting to do it there again, but that's not been possible really. So here is the first digital Lit Fest. It reflects the Lit Fest, some of the values and concerns that my father had. One of his great passions was the education of the girl child, and then the concern for the ecology. And being the LitFest takes place in a cantonment, so it's dedicated to the Indian soldier. But before I go on, I just want to give a slight, small whiff of the kind of person Khushwant Singh was. A poem, he was not religious at all. He hardly ever went to a Gurdwara, but he studied all the religions with a real passion. Sikhism, of course, he wrote a 2-volume history of the Sikhs, Islam, a great deal, and Hinduism and Christianity. Now, one poem that he loved and which I'll just mention very briefly was a poem called Abu Ben Adam. And it talks about Abu Ben Adam waking up one night and finding an angel in his room. And he asked the angel, "What are you writing?" Angel was writing in a book. He asked the angel, "What are you writing?" The angel replied, "I'm writing the names of all those who love the Lord." And Abu Ben asked the angel, "Is my name there?" So the angel says, "Nay, not so. Sorry, it's not there." So he says, "Tell God that I love my fellow human beings." And the angel comes back the next night and says, Abu Ben Adam, you are at the top of the list. Now, that was the kind of man my father was. He used to often say, worship is not work. Worship is not work. Work is worship. And the two great people who he always kept a large photograph of in his study in Kasauli were Mother Teresa and Mahatma Gandhi. They were his real heroes. Okay, I've said enough, I think. I'll now pass you on to Indra Chandrasekhar. We all call her Indy. She's been to all the lit fests in Kasauli. Though she didn't know my father that well, I think she knew a lot of what he wrote. And so on to you, Indy. And no, but before I pass you on to Indy, I just like to mention that Fareed Zakaria, who's here, Fareed was born and brought up in Bombay. And his parents were very close friends of my father. And I'm hoping that he'll say a few words about my father and what kind of influence my father had on him. Okay, over to you, Indy.
Thank you, Rahul. Truly, it's a privilege to be part of the Khushwant Singh Literature Festival. Yes, my memories of the festival at Kasauli are just ripe in my mind, because I think that what you and Lufer have done is really invoked the spirit of your father, whom, as you said, I did not unfortunately know. But through the festival and, of course, through his writings, I have a great picture of him as someone who was so committed to literature and yet was able to laugh at himself and at the world despite the many, many cruelties we face. This digital festival today is very special indeed, because we are launching into the world 3 books. I think Mr. Zakaria's book has been already made visible in the world elsewhere, but in India it's the first launch. The previous session, we talked about one of the great cruelties that has resulted from the pandemic, the migration of the underprivileged in India. I think today's book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, I think is going to give us a sense of how to deal with this extraordinary global phenomenon that we are going through. I think nobody needs an introduction to the, if I may say it, I don't know if it's politically correct to say, the very dashing Mr. Fareed Zakaria. He is an Indian-American journalist, a political scientist, an author, the host of CNN's show Fareed Zakaria GPS, and he writes a weekly column for the Washington Post. He's been a columnist for Newsweek, editor for Newsweek International, and editor of Large, etc., etc. I can go on. But your face is familiar to us, Mr. Zakaria, and we're greatly privileged to have you here at the festival to talk about your book, to talk to him in conversation. Again, someone who needs no introduction, an anchor of We the People, one of NDTV's flagship primetime shows, Sarah Jacob, and she is a face that's familiar to all of us who watch television in India. And I won't go on with an introduction of all the wonderful things she's done, because I'm sure you all want to go straight into talking about Mr. Zakaria's book and its symbolic digital launch. Thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Indy. Yes, you're right. Let's get straight to it. Sorry, Fareed. So the COVID-19 pandemic, it's one of the defining events of our lifetimes. There's no question, as Indy points out, it's going to change our world in so many ways. What is harder to say, though, is how and to what extent, right? And to be able to intelligently answer these questions, one would need to do an enormous amount of reading and research on a wide range of subjects, or one could just go to Fareed Zakaria's latest book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, at least as a starting point. So Fareed Zakaria, great to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Sarah. And let me, if I may, just begin by answering Rahul's charge, which is to say something about Khushwant Singh. So Khushwant Singh was probably one of the two or three biggest influences in my life. And he's one of the most extraordinary characters I've ever met in my life. As Rahul said, he spent the time when he was between the late 60s and early 70s. He was the editor of the Illustrated Weekly, where my mother worked, and they became very close. My father and he became very fast friends. He lived in Bombay without his wife and kids. I mean, Rahul was already quite old, but at that point he was editor of the Reader's Digest. So he became a member of our family in some sense. He'd come to the house 2 or 3 times for dinner, and he became a kind of mentor to my brother and me. He taught me how to swim. He taught me how to play tennis. He taught me poetry. In fact, I remember him reciting that poem Rahul mentioned, Abu Ben Adam, may his tribe increase, awoke one night from a deep dream of peace. And on to the last line, which says, and lo, Ben Adam's name led all the rest. It's impossible to quantify the degree, the extent of the influence or my gratitude, but it was also great fun. He was one of the most charming, funny people you could ever find. I remember, the light bulb that is the symbol of this festival. I remember being in his office when Mario Miranda brought that sketch to him, and he said, you don't have enough things that tell people that I'm a dirty old, I can't even use the word on TV. Put in a bottle of scotch and put in an open centerfold of Playboy. And so Mario went back, and if you look carefully at the image, you'll see that. I remember a heartbreaking moment, and I'll end with this. He was fired from the Illustrated Weekly for political reasons, and he decided to go back to Delhi. And I remember my mother and my brother Arshad and I took him to the train station, to the Victoria Terminus, as it was called in those days. And we saw him off. And I still remember choking up at that time because he had been such a large influence on my life. And I didn't know whether it would continue. And in fact, it didn't, because it was very hard to recapture that kind of an intense relationship. But I like to think, a very large part of Khushwant Singh still lives within me.
Thank you, Fareed. Thank you for sharing that. We know you have another appointment after this, so let's get on to the book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Now, you've structured this book as 10 lessons, so let me start with the first lesson, and it says, buckle up. Ultimately, countries are on their own. One of the haunting, spine-chilling statements really in this book. This emergency, you say, has highlighted one of the oldest truths about international life, that ultimately countries are all on their own, that cooperation comes to a halt. So is it the death of globalism, of an interconnected world as we know it?
Well, it's a great question, Sarah. So one of the things that I think we've all seen in this pandemic is, as I write, that countries ultimately are on their own. That when you strip the facade off, when you face these crises, you realize, as often happens with individuals, right? We come to realize maybe, with the family, that you're on your own. But what that points to is the challenge, which is we are on our own. As nations, we are on our own. But the problem is global. The problem crosses borders. Yeah. And so there is an instinct to draw inward. And you see it in every country. You see it in the United States, obviously, with Trump. But you've also seen it in China. You see it in India. Yeah. But, there's a kind of greater realism that I talk about at the end of the book, which recognizes that the only way out of these situations is to fight that tendency toward parochialism and nationalism and find ways to cooperate with other countries, because the only solution to a global problem is going to be global. So if you look at the World Health Organization, the United States, out of a fit of pique, has withdrawn from the organization because it feels that it wasn't tough enough on China. It has a fair point that the World Health Organization wasn't tough enough on China. But the answer surely is that what we need is a stronger World Health Organization, better funded, and frankly, more capable, more independent of standing up to a powerful nation that says we will not let your inspectors in, or we will not share information with you, whether that be China or the United States, by the way. The United States has set up the World Health Organization in a way because it did not want an international organization poking its nose into America's business. So there is a kind of greater realism in coming to grips with this reality. And I give you one final example. The European Union went through exactly the cycle you described at the start. Turned inward, the Italians started blaming the Germans started blaming the Italians, and then they came to a realization that they were about to destroy this extraordinary project of the common European home and the European Union. And so they reversed course. And what has happened as a result of the pandemic is Europe is now more closely aligned, more deeply intertwined. The Germans have effectively guaranteed the debts of other countries for the first time ever. So rather than splitting them apart, it brought them together. And so what I hope will happen is that we resist this very natural, almost biological urge to turn inward, and recognize actually at the end of the day, there is no alternative to greater global cooperation.
Okay, so there's no alternative, you say, but yet, as you just mentioned, you touched upon, faced with COVID-19, many retreated into selfishness, as you put it, led by Trump's America. You say COVID-19 is a global phenomena that has paradoxically caused nations everywhere to turn inward. Where would you place India in this framework? Because Prime Minister Modi too has reminded Indians of the dangers of global supply chains. He's pushed for vocal for local. He's pushed for made in India.
You know, this is one of the many contradictions. It may be the central contradiction in Narendra Modi's worldview. Modi, I think, sees himself as a man who is going to make India great. I don't know whether the great again part is true, but he certainly wants India to be a major player, a major actor on the world stage, a major global economy. And yet there is deep within the BJP and the RSS and Modi a kind of nationalism that says foreign goods are bad, foreign technology is bad. We should have a kind of national self-reliance. And so what you saw with COVID-19 is that side, that latter side of Modi coming out very strongly. The problem is it entirely conflicts with and contradicts the earlier point, the first trend, which is if you want to make India great, if you want India to be able to prosper, it is going to have to embrace the world. It is going to have to embrace the world economy. It is going to have to open up its systems. Look, Rahul and I are both old enough to remember very well the old India, which believed very strongly in Swadeshi and in high tariffs, and everything foreign was viewed with suspicion. We blocked foreign goods, foreign ideas, foreign services. And what did it result in? It resulted in stagnation, corruption, dysfunction. So in order to move ahead, the BJP is going to have to come to grips with this reality. And I don't know which way it'll come out. I used to think that the BJ's economic modernizing impulse would overwhelm its nationalist parochial impulse. But I think what we have seen with Narendra Modi over the last few years in particular is that parochial, nationalist, sectarian impulse is very strong. It is very deep. It is perhaps in the DNA of the party and of its members, including Modi himself. So I have to say right now, the evidence is that India will not move forward in kind of in the way that it needs to embrace foreign ideas, foreign technology, foreign goods. And when it says foreign, I just mean the best in the world. Like any place, if you look at the way China modernized, it simply said, what is, the two questions Bill Gates says he always asks when he confronts any problem. Who is doing this best, and how can we learn from it and copy? We still have a tendency to look with a certain suspicion at everything that comes from outside. And part of that is the nationalist movement. Part of it is other things. But I do think Modi contains within himself a great deal of that BJP DNA. And unless he can shake it, I think you're going to see a kind of an India that is smaller and more parochial, unfortunately.
You say it's an impulse, a natural impulse, but nationalists will point out that multilateral cooperation did not prevent this pandemic, right? Global institutions, as you say in your book, trusted to handle this disease outbreaks globally, have performed poorly. You mentioned the WHO; they kept vacillating about whether there was even a human-to-human transmission, whether you should wear masks or not wear masks.
No, you're right. Look. There are all kinds of problems with the multilateral process. Part of this, by the way, is just the reality that this was a evolving situation. I think people have gotten used to the idea, and I write about this in the book, that science gives you the answer, and it gives you some beautiful photograph, and you immediately know the answer. Science is a process. It is a mode of inquiry. It is a process of trial and error, and as new facts come, new conclusions emerge. Initially, it wasn't clear how dangerous this was. It became clear later on. It's important to point out that by the time the WHO came to its conclusion that this was a global pandemic, everybody had plenty of time. So the South Koreans performed magnificently. The Taiwanese performed magnificently. Not using huge amounts of resources. Both of them are flourishing democracies, by the way, so it was no great use of police force. It was just being smart, being intelligent, being aggressive, acting early. So that was the key here that certainly the United States did not do. The challenge again becomes, do you look at the dysfunction of the international system and say, therefore we should junk it? Or do you say, therefore we should strengthen it? And what I would argue is there isn't really an alternative. Look, when India needs supplies, when it runs out, where does it go? It bought them from abroad. When it needed aid, where did it go? It gets it from outside. The whole process of scientific knowledge sharing that is going on as a result of this is part of globalization. If we get a vaccine, the only way 4 billion people in the world are going to get vaccinated, which is what you need to end this pandemic, is going to be global cooperation.
So either we're all secure, and we can only do that if everyone has some kind of security. But okay, let's move on to another theme, another major theme: inequality. Right? The pandemics really should be a great equalizer because infectious diseases or should be blind to nationality, race, class, creed. But you say in this book that COVID-19 is the great unequalizer when it comes to global inequality. Why?
Well, if you look at from a global perspective, the most extraordinary thing about the globe economically over the last 25 years had been the reduction in inequality for the first time in 250 years, probably longer. That is to say, ever since the West took off and became much richer and more powerful than the rest of the world, the inequality between the advanced nations of the world and the poor nations has been growing. Over the last 25 years, this process was reversed, largely because of economic growth in China, secondarily because of economic growth in India. So hundreds of millions of people moved out of abject poverty and started making not $1 a day, but $2 a day or $3 a day. My fear is, and I think that early data is clear that I'm right, my fear is that this is being reversed by COVID, because what has happened is the pandemic has hit the poorest and most vulnerable hardest. So in rich countries in the world, you have terrible dislocations, but you have governments that have resources to subsidize businesses, to provide unemployment insurance, to provide public health assistance. Poorer countries, of course, have none of this. In addition, the richest countries in the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, China, have the ability to issue debt in their own currency, which means they can borrow their way out of this problem. India does not have that luxury. India borrows in a foreign currency, the dollar. Yeah. And that always makes you vulnerable. And that's true for most of the indeed the entire developing world. But even within countries, by the way, you see massive rises in inequality. So look at India. You know, the small but growing digital world is flourishing. The biggest companies in India that have nationwide operations, that have strong lines of credit, that have strong brands, they're going to be fine. The Hindustan Levers will be fine. But the mom and pop, the dukandar, is going to be in trouble. He or she cannot afford to close down. He or she has no lines of credit. The day wage worker who literally earns every day to be able to spend on food is in trouble with these lockdowns. People with modest savings are not. So everywhere you are seeing this pull. It's a great tragedy, because you are reversing one of the few unambiguous achievements of in the global economy for the last 20 or 30 years. You are now returning to a world where, even within the world, not just within countries, even within the world, the rich are getting richer and the poor are at the very best stagnating. In many cases, they're getting poorer.
So we've been set back. But when we talk about inequality, one of the most contentious issues staring us in the face will be the distribution of a vaccine whenever we have one, because then the world will be divided along a new fault line, right? You have the haves and the have-nots. Will that determine inequality going forward?
Oh, absolutely. Look, you are going to have, without any question, there will be countries that will be first in line for the vaccine. And they are going to be able to vaccinate their populations faster and quicker than others. My hope is, and I will certainly argue very vociferously for this, that we recognize that as an act of sensible international public policy, we make sure that people get vaccinated everywhere on a relatively quick basis, but also as a matter of morality. The truth is, we are not all safe unless everybody is either vaccinated. Every country needs to achieve herd immunity through vaccination. That is only going to happen if the richest countries in the world band together and do it. And as I point out in the book, there are precedents for this. Even at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States came together to vaccinate the world and to eradicate smallpox. And this was, these two countries armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, staring down each other, almost ready to go to nuclear war. We have no such rivalry right now. Why would it be difficult for the United States and China and Europe to get together and say, we are going to vaccinate the world? It's fine to vaccinate the US and China and Europe first, but very quickly thereafter, the rest of the world should be vaccinated. One point here, India is in a unique position. It is the only developing country that happens to have indigenous pharmaceutical capacity. And so there's a very good chance India will be among the first countries that will be able to vaccinate itself, because very likely one of these early vaccines will be India.
So the fifth lesson, coming to the fifth lesson here, life is digital. Now that's something we've been hearing a lot about, and there are clearly some things that are better done digitally, perhaps possibly going to a doctor, as we found out over the last 8 months. And there are others that aren't. And as the mother of a 5-year-old, I can tell you that elementary school education is one of them. But as a journalist, Fareed Zakaria, I'm interested, what about politics? Because we're seeing two major elections taking place in the middle of a pandemic. You have the US election, of course, and the Bihar election back home. Now, both Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi, they relied hugely on the power of social media for their elections. Yet now, just now, we've learned that the second presidential election in the US is not going to go ahead. It's been cancelled. What does this pandemic mean for politics, for campaigning as we know it? Pressing the flesh, the conventional, kissing the babies. What is this? What are the implications on politics? What kind of leaders? The implication. What kind of leaders are elected? The style of leadership or the style of campaigning. Are there advantages and disadvantages here, you think?
It's a great question, Sarah. I think that we are all going through this stress test of what digital life looks like. We've had the technologies, certainly in the US and to a lesser extent in India, by which I mean not everybody is as connected in India as in the US. But now we've been forced to, on a massive scale, adopt them. Some of them have been successful. So telehealth has been extraordinarily successful. People now realize that if they have a headache, they don't actually need to go to their doctor. They can do a quick televisit, and that the doctor can tell you on the video, take an aspirin and call me in the morning. You don't need to actually have a physical visit. School, I agree with you, is much more difficult. I have 3 kids, and I entirely agree with you. I think that there are a lot of kinks in the model, and we will end up with some kind of hybrid model that will emerge. Same with work, by the way. I find that working virtually has many advantages, but it has disadvantages as well. You lose a lot of the texture and the morale and the soft skills of teamwork and development. You spend social capital when you are online and when you're working virtually. You don't build social capital. So those are challenges. Now, you asked, in some ways, the most interesting one and the most consequential one, how does it change politics? So I think the things I was saying about business are also true in politics. People with strong brand names do well. People who have established, personas and images tend to do well. Newcomers will find it hard to break through in this process. And so at some, kind of larger level, that is the lesson. But when you're dealing with people like Trump and Modi, these are known quantities. Their opponents are known quantities. So I don't think it changes the dynamic that much. If you look at the US race, the fact that Trump is, quite frankly, a much more colorful personality than Joe Biden has not changed the fact that, one of the things people outside America don't realize is Trump has always been unpopular. Trump has been unpopular when he ran in 2016. He's been unpopular throughout his 4 years as president. 52 to 55% of Americans have disapproved of him. And that hasn't changed as a result of any of this. In 2016, because of the fact he was running against another very unpopular candidate, Hillary Clinton, who for whatever reason was unpopular in the United States, he managed to win because the strange way the American system works, in 3 states, 70,000 votes made the difference. But I don't think it changes the dynamic. In India, there's a more interesting question, which is to what extent will Narendra Modi's religion plus caste strategy work in a situation where he has not delivered on what he claimed was his principal, platform. If you remember when he first ran, Sarah, he said, all I want to talk about is vikas, growth. Well, on that metric, he's done very badly. But he has been very clever about using the nationalist card, stoking a certain amount of resentment towards Muslims, aligning himself with lower caste parties. And I can't tell whether all that will work or whether people will step back and say, this is all fundamentally deflection because you have not delivered on the thing that you promised, that you said we should judge you by, which was vikas.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. Let me check if we have questions coming in and start wrapping up. So overall, Fareed Zakaria, you say this is the pandemic. It's been bigger than 9/11. It's bigger than the global financial crisis. But you also say it's an opportunity, not just for the US and for the world. Why is that?
Well, because first to begin to recognize just how broad the effect of this has been. So if you look at 9/11, it really affected the United States, a few Western countries. It affected our ability to travel as easily. So they put up, these screening systems at airports and such, resulted in my view, an excessive rise of government interference in both travel and communication. If you look at the global financial crisis, the banks and companies that were highly leveraged were affected. I was talking to a small business owner the other day who said that, the global financial crisis didn't affect me directly at all because I had not taken on too much debt. I was not one of these big banks. The only effect it had on me was the economy slowed down. And so I had to, I had to take that into account. He said, now every single business in the world has been affected. Every single family in the world has been affected. I don't think we have had a crisis like that really since World War II, where everybody in the world in some way or the other bears the marks directly of this problem. So therein lies the opportunity, because what has happened is we have all been forced to confront this crisis. We have all been forced to change our ways. And change is only possible when everybody's lives have been dislocated already. There's a certain kind of fluidity at that point, and then you can argue for new solutions, because you can't, it's very difficult to say, well, we're just going to continue business as usual, or even a restoration. The old is already old, it's past. So if you think about what you could achieve with this new model, you could say we have taken the opportunity to restructure healthcare. We are taking the opportunity to restructure the economy. The government needs to be more involved in guaranteeing certain kinds of rights or procedures. So all that becomes much more possible because everyone agrees we're in crisis. Everyone is dislocated. Everyone knows you can't just push a button and go back to normal. And if you can find enlightened leadership at that point, you can imagine a very different future. So, when the Great Depression hit, the natural instinct of most people was to say, we're just going to, get through this and go back to normal. That was what the then President Herbert Hoover said. But Franklin Roosevelt comes along and says, no, we are going to use this to fundamentally change the relationship that government has to its citizens. Government is going to become responsible for the first time for a kind of economic floor below which we will not let citizens drop. That was a completely novel idea. No government did that. And by 1950, it would be fair to say that every Western country had adopted some version of that Rooseveltian idea. So could we see something like that? Well, yes, but it does require that crucial ingredient, which is leadership.
But the question that the Indian government and Indian businesses are asking is, can this be an opportunity for India? You've mentioned in the book Bangladesh, Vietnam, Romania as possible beneficiaries of the lessened trust in China, but not India. Why is that? And what might India do to take advantage of this opportunity?
So look, one of the things that this pandemic has highlighted, and I write about this a lot in the book, is that it has shown that the great debate of the 20th century was the quantity of government you have. Should you have a big government or small government? What I think we're seeing in the 21st century is that the issue is not the quantity of government, it's the quality of government. How efficient is your government? How well does it serve its people? Does it understand how to adopt best practices? Many of the countries that did best, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, have actually very small governments as a percentage of GDP. So India does not figure well in that list, because one of the striking features of India, unfortunately, is the degree of incompetence of the Indian government. India's government is incompetent by every global standard, and this has really never been addressed fundamentally. So it's not just a question of the size, because in some areas the Indian government is very big, but in other areas it's tiny. For example, tax collection. India is terrible at tax collection. And no matter what you think taxes should be, I think you could say there should be a general consensus in the country that whatever they are, people should pay them. There's no great virtue in having a nation of tax cheats. But India has extremely poor tax collection systems. Part of it is the system is so complicated and unwieldy. Part of it is that individual bureaucrats milk the system to gain their own personal advantage, or via corruption. Part of it is there's no proper oversight. So if you look at that simple example, tax collection as a kind of symbol of the problem in India, you understand that more than anything else, India just has to get its act together with regard to government. People talk about corruption in India, and I often say, look, there's corruption in most of these developing countries, but you have corruption in China, which results in this. You have a big project, there's a lot of corruption, but the project gets built on time, very efficiently, and the bridge works, and the train works. In India, you have lots of corruption. The project is delayed for 10 years, and it never gets built, or if it gets built, it breaks down. That's where we have not achieved the ability to execute. And until government can execute, it is going to find itself on the back foot in many of these kinds of crises.
All right, you talked about China. Your ninth lesson is that the world is bipolar. Your book doesn't talk about just American decline, but it does so in the context of the rise of China. Similarly, there's also a great deal of disappointment in the way the US has conducted itself on the international stage over the last few years. How much of this changes if the poll suggests that Joe Biden wins next month? Are we back then to a world where the US conducts itself as a responsible leader, where US foreign policy is led by experienced diplomats, where the US seeks, as you mentioned before, to build international consensus, to build international institutions, not destroy them? Is there a structural problem? Is there a deeper problem? Or how much does that change if Trump is not reelected?
Great question. Look, there's no doubt that Joe Biden will represent a kind of return to the basic norms of American foreign policy and diplomacy that have governed the country since 1945. Trump really is an anomaly. Trump is a rejection of 75 years of American foreign policy that has looked at America as being the leader of a world the creator of an international system, willing to bear certain burdens and pay certain prices, and that believed that at the end of the day, that this kind of interconnected world with an engaged America at the helm was going to result in greater peace, greater stability, and ultimately greater freedom and prosperity. Trump has a much more transactional relationship with the world. I mean, Trump is sort of like the landlord who just wants to figure out, are you paying me enough rent? And if the Germans are not paying enough rent, that's all he's obsessed with. But we can't just go back to normal because the world has changed. As I say in the book, we really have entered a bipolar world. And you can see the mark of bipolarity by the fact that US and China are now just leagues ahead of every other country in the world. So the US is the largest economy in the world. China is the second largest economy in the world. But China is then larger than the next 4 economies put together. So you take Japan, Germany, Britain, I think it's France, and you put them all together, and the Chinese economy is larger than that. Same is true in military terms. So we have now entered that bipolar world where there are 2 powers above all the rest. What does that world look like? How do we navigate it? How does every country fit in and navigate its own realm in this? The US has not figured it out, has not really, I think, confronted that. And that would be the great challenge for a Biden administration. It is, of course, also the great strategic challenge for India. India has not thought seriously about strategy, in my view, for a long time, and with a few exceptions, momentarily Manmohan Singh, who was very smart, much wiser on foreign policy than people realize when he initiated the nuclear deal with the US. Manmohan Singh had it. But other than that, you really have had, since Jawaharlal Nehru formulated the principles of non-alignment in the 1950s, you have not had a creative, strategic process of thinking through what India's interests are in the world, what the world looks like. And as a result, Indian foreign policy is essentially reactive. It becomes a series of photo ops about visiting leaders. There are a few impulses here and there. When Prime Minister Modi says he wants his foreign policy to be multi-aligned, it's frankly a kind of meaningless concept. It is to have a strategy is to choose. And what saying that you're multi-aligned means is you refuse to choose. You refuse to try to figure out what the world looks like and what direction India should be pointing in.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, so let's get one audience question in, Fareed. The question says, thinking of Maslow's hierarchy, today everyone in the world is at the bottom of the pyramid and seeking safety. Any comment?
Well, it's a very good point. Maslow's hierarchy, for those who don't remember, says that when you look at what people's needs and wants are, they start out with security and then they move up to things like freedom and prosperity and self-expression and things like that. And it's very true that we have moved further down Maslow's hierarchy, and that's why I say there's a turn towards selfishness, a turn towards parochialism, a turn toward nationalism. But the irony, as I point out in the book, is that the only way to get out of Maslow's hierarchy is to embrace a certain degree of cooperation, to embrace others, to try to find ways to work with people. So if you think about it, for the US, it's obvious. The US is 5% of the world's population. If it wants to have a large place in the world, it is going to have to buy and sell and talk and engage with other countries around the world. If you think about it in India, in terms for India, India is 3% of the world economy. If India wants to grow, it has to find a way to hook up with the rest, the other 95% of the world economy. And so finding a way to get people out of that comfort zone where they have turned inward, and finding a way to make people realize what it will take is a great challenge. But the one thing I hope happens is that if you ask a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, what do you look for in an entrepreneur? People will often say they like entrepreneurs who have failed. And a very veteran venture capitalist once said to me, well, that's not true. We obviously prefer success to failure. But what we look for is if somebody has failed, have they learned from that failure? And if you look around the world at the countries that have done well with COVID, It's countries that failed, for example, with their experience with SARS, Taiwan, South Korea. It's even countries that have had broader failures than that. Germany. The thing about Germany is after 45, it said to itself, we really screwed up. We need to we need a deep introspective look at what we got wrong and reform our institutions, rebuild our country, rebuild our society, rebuild our culture. I think that Indians are not as capable of introspection as they should be. There's a great deal of sort of phony jingoism and phony cultural pride that doesn't ask, what are we doing badly? How can we learn? How can we reform ourselves? And that needs to be a national conversation. By the way, the United States is not very good at this either. And I worry about both countries, because if you look at the countries that have tended to do badly in COVID, it's countries that have this kind of smug exceptionalism about them. The United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil in Latin America has a great deal of the same kind of cultural chauvinism. And India has some of that. And so I think one of the challenges in a world going forward is, it's something we should all think about. When you fail, be humble, learn from that failure, ask yourself what you got wrong, ask yourself how you can do better. And if we can't do that as a country and as a culture, it will have long-term effects that are going to be bad.
Well, Fareed, we could go on, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Right now, you've done a remarkable job of condensing an enormous amount of knowledge and insight in one book, and your ability to paraphrase all of that for us here tonight is even more remarkable. Thank you so much for your time, Fareed Zakaria.
Well, Sarah, I have to tell you, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. It is always a huge pleasure to talk to somebody who's actually read the book, as it was evident you've done. And so I'm enormously grateful to you. I'm very grateful to Rahul for inviting me to do this. As I say, it's a very small way that I can repay the enormous debt of gratitude I feel to Khushwant Singh.
Thank you very much indeed. What a deeply insightful session. What a treat it was to have Mr. Zakaria with us. What a wonderful job you did, Sarah, of extricating information from the book so that all of us who haven't yet read the book, I'm sure we'll all go out and buy it, we really, really entered the book and really, really had a sense of the many difficult parts ahead of us. Thank you very much. I can go on, but I know you're short of time, Mr. Zakaria. So thank you very much. I do want to say that for us who were listening to this session, the fact that we're looking at it from a perspective not of the individual, but of a society and a government is a very, very important way to think about the impact that the pandemic has had, and it takes us out of ourselves to thinking about this in the global sense. So it really was a great session in that sense as well. Don't go away. We have another session coming. In the one of the things that Mr. Zakaria said was, in fact, talking about self-reflection, and I think the next session, which is going to really enter a book which is about someone who went on a long, solitary journey in a very solitary space, will surely take us into the world of self-reflection. Coming up soon, Jono Limin and I have to get this right for certain. I cannot mix up names now. Coming up next is Jono Limin and Erling Kage, who will be talking about walking through the Himalayas in remote areas. Apologies for getting the names wrong. Look forward to seeing you all in a very few minutes. Thank you.